Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week we're featuring two interviews. First up, you'll hear from Xavier de Janon, NLG Director of Mass Defense, who's worked on the Stop Cop City case and is currently also working on the DFW Prairieland case, where federal and Texas prosecutors have been pursuing prosecution of 18 people so far related to the noise demo of July 4th, 2025 at the Prairieland Detention Center in Texas. We speak about the case and the wider web of repression being pushed by the Trump administration in the name of battling ANTEEFAH. For more information on Javier's work, visit NLG.org. Then we'll speak with two members of the DFW Defendants Support Committee following the announcement last Wednesday by the committee concerning pressure on the defendants to take plea deals and some updated perspectives on the case since it was recorded more recently than the Javier interview. For more info and updates, you can visit dfwdefendants.wordpress.com. One quick announcement before we start is that Malik Mohammed, 2020 uprising prisoner you heard in our August 17th, 2025 episode, has spent the better part of a year in solitary confinement in Oregon and could use some support. There's a post with more information plus a new fundraiser at their website, malikspeaks.noblogs.org, also linked in our show notes.
Hi there, my name is Xavier de Janon. I use he, him pronouns. I am based in North Carolina, but I work during the day for the National Lawyers Guild, and I also take on criminal defendants with political cases across the South.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. Would you explain what the NLG is, how it came about, and what you all do? Like, what does the Director of Mass Defense, for instance, do at your organization?
Certainly. So the NLG, the National Lawyers Guild, is a bar association, but it is not only limited on membership to attorneys. We also have law students, legal workers, and jailhouse lawyers. And essentially, it is a member-based organization where people join and are in a broader network. The NLG has very specific values and principles that people label as progressive, but more specifically, they are anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and so on. What I do as Director of Mass Defense is oversee our Mass Defense program, which specifically provides support to protesters, activists, organizers, and really people in community who are rising up for justice and against injustice in protest. So my work is very broad and changes a lot with everything that's happening right now. But generally, I would describe it as just protest defense and supporting the right to dissent and the right to protest.
I don't know if you have any words about why you think that the founders of the NLG thought that it was necessary to found. I imagine that the ACLU already existed. Is there a distinction between the organizations? I'm not trying to get any sort of hot mic moments or anything like that. But yeah, how does the NLG differ from the ACLU, for instance?
I won't say that I am a NLG history buff by any means, but part of the origin story of National Lawyers Guild actually had to do with segregation. So NLG started in the 1930s, and it was the first desegregated bar association. And so essentially people who weren't white were allowed in, and other bar associations were not that way in the 30s. So I understand that to be one of the origin stories. But the NLG is actually born in response to the American Bar Association, the ABA. The ABA is the, I'm going to say, normative bar association in the country. And the ABA is the one that creates model rules of professional conduct. It has a lot of opinions. It provides trainings. And it's just the largest bar association in some ways, or most popular. So the NLG actually existed in response to the ABA and disagreements with the ABA. As the years passed, the NLG faced a lot of federal repression. I think it just organically evolved into what it is now, which is a home for more progressive or anti-system legal workers. And unlike other legal organizations, I would add the NLG doesn't directly litigate, right? Like the NLG national office isn't representing people on cases. Instead, our members do that. around the country.
So I'm hoping we can start off talking about the Prairieland case out of the Dallas-Fort Worth or DFW area. Listeners may recall an interview that we did back in July about this case, recorded just a week or so after the inciting incident. Could you summarize what's known about what took place at Prairieland ICE Detention Facility in Texas on July 4th, 2025?
Definitely try to give a big picture of what we know or we've learned that happened on July 4th in Johnson County. We have learned, and I think it's not denied, that what happened that night on July 4th was a noise demonstration outside of an ICE detention center, and it's the Prairieland Detention Center in North Texas. Noise demonstrations are popular, and essentially what was happening that day, like any other noise demo, was people showing up to make loud noise outside of the ICE facility, and nearby it too. But what ended up happening eventually was that local police arrived, and then the federal government is alleging that shots were fired. However, there's also reports that there were fireworks being used at the noise demonstration. And it's not denied either that people were engaging in graffiti and making art at the protest itself. So after the alleged shots were fired, then people started getting arrested, and a very large and invasive federal investigation happened after that night that has resulted in a total of 18 people facing very serious charges. Only 10 of those people were alleged to be at the actual demonstration, and then the rest were arrested after the surveillance and these investigations. So in a nutshell, it was an anti-ICE noise demonstration that then ended up with a bunch of arrests. And, I can speak more about this type of protest. ICE rallies are happening all around the country, especially at the detention centers. So this is not something exceptional or different or new. And what is different, though, is its location, right? It's in North Texas.
Sure, yeah. If you could talk a little bit about the noise demo as a type of protest, how common they are, what they do. Like, I know I've heard of them for years. Is like a lot of cities have started over the last decade, maybe decade and a half, doing them on New Year's Eve outside of just jails or prisons, right?
So noise demonstrations are a form of protest, really, and it's essentially just being very loud outside of a prison, a jail, a detention center, a place where people are locked up and caged. And the name is just what it is. People go and make a lot of noise to express solidarity with the people behind bars, because although they can't be seen or they can't be visited inside, the noise demonstration does reach people behind bars, right? The noise itself is what is being communicated to the people to remind them that they're not alone, that people are, paying attention to them and supporting them. And as you mentioned, they are common. In fact, there was even a very popular noise demonstrations for Luigi Mangione outside of his detention center, his federal detention. And it was in the news. There was all these reportings about people inside using lights to communicate with reporters who were dumbfounded that this was happening, right? There was all this curiosity around that noise demonstration. And that just tells you how popular they are. I mean, they are just another form of protest in this country.
But the prosecutors are alleging that this was some sort of ambush, right? Like, it seems like there's a misrepresentation of whether or not there was gunfire exchange. That's kind of crazy, but making noise, I could see how fireworks outside of a facility would be misrepresented or maybe misunderstood as being something like explosions or firearms. But I don't know. It seems like it's part of a bigger story that they're trying to weave. Anyway, maybe that's speculation. I can cut that out if that's not helpful.
I mean, part of what the federal government is alleging, and, they have press releases on this, is that the purpose of the noise demonstration was to draw out agents like police, cops, to ambush them and attack them. This is the story they've been telling since the incidents of July 4th. And they really put out their media machine to make that story stick with mainstream media, that this was a planned ambush and that the noise demonstration was to draw people out into the ambush. What I find telling is that this same ambush language is being used for a situation that happened in Chicago, where a a shooting broke out because the police started shooting at protesters after they were allegedly blocked in. And they make the same theory that the protesters intentionally took these actions to target and attack the police instead of the purpose being a protest, a rally, a disruption, right? The purpose of a noise demonstration is to reach the people inside and the public. The police's response is just how they respond to that.
Yeah, and I don't have the details in front of me, but I recall that story coming out about the ambush and the cars blocking in Chicago, ICE agents, and then that having to get like retracted or body cam footage afterwards being like, that's not actually at all what happened. But yeah, I can try to put a link in the show notes for a story related to that. I guess, so while trying to figure out what is being alleged by the state or by the government or the governments in this case, keeping track of indictments and charges has been kind of difficult because of differing court systems and differing charges and differing jurisdictions. How much of this case is federal? How much is state? And can you speculate on why there's some in one and some in another venue? Also, like, how does this affect where defendants are being held?
The original charges against people were at the state level. Originally, people were arrested and taken to Johnson County Jail, which has been talked about as being in awful conditions. And there's reports on how bad the situation is in that jail, like as in many other cages and prisons. And then eventually, federal complaints started coming out against certain people. That then resulted in a lot of defendants being transferred to different detention centers outside of Johnson County or around the area. So now, today, we have this web of different people facing either federal and state charges, or only state charges, or only federal charges. I don't really know what to speculate about this other than state and federal repression, right? The idea of using several prosecutors' offices to bring concurrent charges at the same time, doesn't make sense to me unless it is to repress and stop certain behavior. You actually do see this often in drug-related offenses. The state prosecution will begin against it, and then the federal government will take over a case. But often when that happens, the state charges are dropped because now the federal case is ongoing, or there's a resolution worked out where one of them takes precedence over the other. And what it does, it just creates more stress and the need for more legal support, the need for more lawyers, and just more squeezing of these defendants, if that makes sense. And like I said, I don't really know or I even have a hard time understanding rationale behind these decisions, to be honest, but it just seems to be political repression and throwing the book at these defendants.
Yeah, I recall in 2020 there being a sort of surprise among a lot of people doing anti-repression work when people during protests around the country started facing federal charges, like were initially picked up on state charges and then were passed over to federal districts for prosecution. And then the argument being in some cases like, oh, well, there was a cop car that was damaged. The cop car was a local police department's vehicle, but it was purchased with federal money. And so therefore it's a federal crime. Or like this person, I don't know, had crossed from Washington to Oregon, and therefore it's an interstate decision for them to like be attending this thing. They cross state lines and therefore it's in federal jurisdiction. But yeah, it kind of seems like an opportunity for wielding more resources, but like an alignment of interests by the prosecutors among various jurisdictions.
I would also add that with the expansion of the Joint Terrorism Task Force at the federal level, the cooperation between state police, local police, right, city police, state patrol, and federal agents, the FBI, the DEA, ATF, it's also grown because there are systems and communications between all these agencies set up to allegedly fight terrorism. And that makes collaboration just easier because folks are already in the room, if that makes sense. I remember recently watching a documentary talking about the Raid Area 51 incident, if you remember, where there was this call for people all around the country, go to Area 51, we're taking it over. It was like based on memes and it was a whole thing. In the documentary of the Area 51 takeover, you get to see behind the curtain of just how much cooperation there is between local and federal government. I mean, they're pictures sitting in a room together analyzing this rural county in the United States. So the infrastructure is already there for things like Johnson County to happen this way.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what charges people are facing at the various levels. You don't have to go through like a list of the defendants name by name if you don't want to, but just so that listeners can have like an idea of some of the scope that people are facing.
The basic explanation of the charges revolve around terrorism, an attempted murder charge, and then an assortment of obstruction of investigation, material support to what happened, and variations of those, like obstruction, complicity, conspiracy type charges. But the heart of the cases is these allegations of terrorism, domestic terrorism, at the state level, and then at the federal level, material support for terrorism and attempted murder. Really, the way that the government has framed this situation, and like I said, put it out on the media very, very quickly, is that this was a premeditated, coordinated ambush to kill law enforcement officers. This is really what their theory of the case is, what they're alleging happened on July 4th. And of course, as the case develops and more comes out and the government changes its theory, there are more and more questions as to if that even happened, right? Was there even an attempted murder? And also, was there even any coordination among the defendants? Of course, all the state does is throwing allegations, but how the government is making these allegations with media and press releases and putting people's information out on social media has made certain things appear to be the truth, right? And but that is like the general case. And then, as I mentioned, right, there are some people facing the state charges and then other people facing the federal, but they're just variations of like the same crimes, basically.
And just to be very explicit about this, like one of the allegations from the day of and with like the ambush charges with the claim that there was an exchange of gunfire was this claim that an Alvarado Police Department officer who arrived after being called was shot in the neck and then was hospitalized and then released that same evening. Is that correct?
The central accusation is that a Alvarado police officer was injured on the neck by a gunshot. And it is quite outrageous to imagine that someone shot on the neck by a gunshot would be released the same day and back in the force very quickly. There are additional allegations that there was attempted murders, attempted assaults against other ICE detention center workers, but they all revolve around the same allegations of shooting and that like shooting broke out.
So my understanding is that the first of these trials are set to start in November, but what can you tell us about like what venue is this? Are these trials coming? Are these like state or federal? And which defendants and I guess which charges are those being faced in those instances?
The challenge is that there are numerous people who have federal and state charges, and they were indicted on the state level. So they have, formal criminal charges through an indictment, but their cases were paused because of the federal complaint, making it more confusing. There's actually only 4 people indicted as of today in the federal case. 2 of them are supposed to be scheduled for trial in November, but there was already a decision that the cases are complex and that more people might be indicted with them. So this November date will be moved. It's not going to happen. Another person indicted on the federal charges is supposed to have trial starting in December, but it probably will also be continued if there's motions filed, hearings to be made. And then there's a 4th separately indicted federal defendant who I haven't really seen movement in the case, but I haven't also looked at it too recently. Then there's the state indicted who are not federally charged. And last time I checked, they're supposed to have a motion hearing in December and then trial is supposed to start in January. But with a more recent arrest related to those allegations, that case might also be delayed. So it is a lot to keep up with. And even in saying all this, I know there are a dozen over defendants whose cases might be moving at different paces. But at least in theory, there might be a court date in December for one of the many cases. At least that's what should happen. But yeah, courts change scheduling all the time.
Just if people do decide at this point in the conversation, like they want to start keeping track and seeing who's at least being supported by a support committee, I believe like one website that they could look at is dfwdefendants.wordpress.com.
And there's also a separate Instagram account for Des Sanchez, who is that defendant facing the December charges. And that's free.des.rebel, REVOL.
And Des is also facing federal immigration charges in relation to this. Is that right?
That's correct. Des Sanchez is a green card holder, and because of that, he would probably also face removal proceedings once all these cases are finished.
Let's talk about the growing number of defendants who weren't on site at the noise demo on July 4th. So just assuming that the theory that the prosecutors at various levels are working from, that there was noise demonstration that was actually meant to be an ambush for law enforcement. So like it would make sense in that case as to why you would arrest and attempt to prosecute the people that were on site for it. But I wonder if, again, without like diving too much into speculation as to what the intentions or the arguments that are going to be made by the state and federal prosecutors are, like, can you talk about the conspiracy that's being alleged and what novel approaches the prosecutors are taking towards proof of participation? Like, for instance, when I think of Des, I think about this argument about zines or like radical pamphlets or literature being brought in as some sort of proof of conspiracy, or the use of signal chats.
What is very concerning about the state's allegations is that they're basically just describing in a criminal charge a very serious federal felony, right? It's material support to terrorism, attempted murder of federal agents, and all the associated crimes with that. They just describe how people are modernly organizing and doing activism. They attempt to shed on this very negative light that people were in a Signal group chat together or a Discord group chat, that encrypted communications being shared is somehow criminal. They also make a lot of noise about people meeting before the rally together and arriving in cars together, right? These are just normal things that activists do to get to places. They also take offense that there were security methods taken with the phones, right? That there were Faraday bags to put the phones in to block signal, that all these steps that people take to protect themselves, their identities, their security is somehow reflective of wanting to attempt a murder of a federal agent. I mean, that is the leap that they're trying to make and the argument they're trying to make. Like you said, the proximity to the crime, might have some consequence, right? If there is an allegation that something happened and then someone was nearby or at it, it's normal for people to get arrested, especially in mass arrest situations. But that's not all that happened in this case. It wasn't just the 10 people. Then there were surveillance and follow-ups done because one of the suspects allegedly ran and fled. And so then the surveillance just kind of expanded from there. There were also people's houses raided with flashbangs and all this militarized equipment because the government had already decided that they were facing quote unquote terrorist cell. So this case that they're framing of, people wearing all black, meeting together, encrypted communications, reading political magazines, I mean, that just sounds like a college student starting activism and reading about it and getting involved in group chats and wearing all black to a protest. I don't really see a difference. Of course, there's also the addition that there were a lot of firearms lying around. People had guns in their cars. People were carrying firearms. People were wearing vests and stuff like that, which they also say shows intent. But we can't forget that this happened in North Texas, where carrying firearms at a protest is pretty common, to my understanding, and especially at left-leaning rallies and protests, it is very normal and common for people to have firearms and have protection gear because there's always the risk of counter-protesters coming, right-wingers coming, right? These right-wing militias coming to attack. What is, in this question of novel theories, criminal theories, where I think I am especially concerned, where National Lawyers Guild is very worried, is the criminalization of possession of political content, anti-government content, and of encrypted communications, because that is actually really, really, really concerning for anyone engaging in any type of protest in this country, especially as the federal government gets more outrageous and more violent. people's writings, reflections, poems, zines, pamphlets are going to get even more critical, more inflammatory. This is just normal.
And as far as like the violence of the home raids, as well as the culture of people like open carrying or conceal carrying weapons, there's a really good article that Andrew Lee published in Truth Out called "These Dallas Residents Are on the Front Lines of Trump's War Against Antifa," that interviews a bunch of the individuals who were caught up in the case and family members and friends as well, and talks in more detail about some of that stuff. I think it was a really good read. So I note that there are only 14 people listed on the DFW Defense Committee's website, but there've been at least 18 arrested so far in relation to the case. Are people cooperating with the prosecutors, or is there a solid wall of defense, or is it a little more complicated than that?
I can't comment too specifically on cooperation. I think a lot of it will be like conjecture and reading into things and making inferences. But from what is publicly available, the criminal complaints, the documents on the court dockets, there does seem to be defendants who are giving information to the government that has led to more arrests and that has led to the government just having more information about the case. I'm not sure if that means that people are fully cooperating, right? That is a big accusation or assumption to make, but there are people who are speaking and who have spoken to give information to the government that's helped them in their investigation.
And like as far as you found, does that aid people in avoiding charges or getting diminished sentencing or that sort of thing?
I think first I'll add that in the protest world, in the mass arrest world, it is very common and becoming more and more common for police to arrest way more people than they should or than they have legal grounds to even, because it is very logical that if you take someone who found out about the rally, found out about the noise demo on the internet, showed up maybe with a friend, came with things for the protest, doesn't really have much relationship with people in the activist scene, or if really they just are interested in this struggle against ICE and so showed up. If they arrest that person is just more likely to try to get themselves out of the situation when they were just randomly grabbed or arrested really without much cause. And so they'll talk, right? This is just human conduct too, right? I didn't do anything wrong. I don't have anything to hide. So yeah, I'll talk with the government and get out of this. But I have seen time and time again that when people do that, they still end up locked up in jail. The government still opposes their bond. They can't get out of jail. And the deals that they work out, right? The plea deals in exchange of cooperation, giving more testimony, speaking on trial against other defendants. The plea deals rarely get better than what people who go to trial and get convicted get anyways. So in other words, the actual benefits of cooperating with this federal government especially are not very clear or easy to see. In the end, even with a cooperating plea, people might have in their record a federal felony, material support to terrorism or obstruction, which also has its lifelong consequences. So, in the end, people's decisions are their own. I think criminal defendants have so many things to consider, and they always have the right to make the decision to speak with the government. As the National Lawyers Guild, we respect people's right to their defense and to make their own decisions, informed decisions. But in getting that information, I think it's important to really look at what the potentials are for a conviction, for not guilty, for evidence to be suppressed, for things to be taken out of trial, things to be excluded before making that really intense decision of talking to the government. Because once you do that, there's no walking back either. There's stories that sometimes they're just anecdotal, but once the government learns or discovers that someone is willing to talk, they will continue to want that person to talk more and more and more and expand how many people to talk. And suddenly, this person's whole networks and family are now facing federal government's questions and investigations.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, and this is a different case to bring up because there was crime involved in this, but like Marius Mason's partner, Frank Ambrose, decided to work with the federal government in entrapping and getting Marius convicted, and he's still in, but Frank Ambrose is still on the line. Like if he doesn't continue participating, like if the government calls him up and says, hey, like we want you to try to get into this place or tell us about these people, find out more information, his deal states that he has to be at the whim of the government, and it doesn't have like an end date associated with it. So if he hypothetically decides not to serve the government when they call on him, they could very well just pull his card and say, well, all right, we're going to put you in for those charges we initially had you for. I think it's also important to note that when people go in, federal prosecutors in particular, but I think it's pretty common across the board, apply huge amounts of charges, very serious charges against people, in the assumption that people aren't going to take things to trial, or maybe will cave and start doing the bidding of the state, turn state's witness or whatever, in order to avoid these huge, expensive to fight and very scary charges and possibilities of sentencing. And in a lot of cases, these end up getting whittled down and whittled away once people stand up and fight back. Bullies oftentimes will back down when they are faced with some sort of challenge and defense and response.
Yes, and I'd also add, in terms of cooperation, especially in political cases, that if people will face prison sentences or long probation sentences or other punishment, there will usually be a big network of supporters for political prisoners. We see this letter writing campaigns, money put in the commissary, websites being created, and really just like a lifeline for people behind bars. When someone decides to cooperate or speak to the government and give information about other people, it's very unlikely that this very, very large network of support systems will want to help that person. Because for people who are engaging in dissent, in protest, in activism, when someone speaks to the government and basically turns information against others, their friends, their family, people they know of, their comrades, they would say they're not going to support that person anymore. And so even if the prison sentence, probation sentence is somewhat short, that person will leave their prison term, their punishment, to a lack of community, of social networks, of relationships that people would be happy to provide otherwise. And so even like long term, even longer term, right, than thinking about the conviction, the prison sentence, the probation, what happens after that is still a life that should be worth living. And when there is a disclosure or release, or people find out that there was a cooperation, a snitch, someone giving information, that life might be very, very different.
Yeah, plus you have to live with yourself. So I spoke some weeks ago, I guess like a month and a half ago, with Moira Melter-Cohen on the Trump memos declaring a shadowy cabal referred to as ANTEEFAH as a domestic terrorist organization. Since that conversation, Trump conducted a roundtable with various far-right grifters and influencers, such as InfoWar affiliate Nick Sortor, Pizzagate promoter white nationalist Jack Posobiec, and Andy No protege Katie Daviscourt, among others, and appears to be following through on his promise of attempting to declare ANTEEFAH a foreign terrorist organization, or an FTO, which is something he promised, I think, during his first administration also. But he's at least made public moves and statements within the administration to make this change. Trump is now following in the esteemed footsteps of his fellow competitive authoritarian Viktor Orban in Hungary and the far-right government in Denmark in calling anti-fascists an international conspiracy. It's really easy to poke fun at the emperor's new clothes, but the implications of the FTO status are pretty heavy, particularly with an undefined boogeyman of ANTEEFAH. Can you talk a little bit of your understandings of the status of the declaration of FTO for a decentralized movement being labeled as an organization? And is there a legal path? Like, is this something that legally will become a thing, or would this just be for the administration, like, we're going to pursue them as this thing even if we don't have the official declaration and documentation that the government recognizes them as such?
So the process for the government to designate a foreign terrorist organization, an FTO, is pretty behind closed doors. It involves the Department of State, the Department of Treasury, Congress, Federal Registry. There's an internal process where the government determines if a certain organization qualifies as a foreign terrorist organization. After something is designated as an FTO, there are ways to challenge it administratively, judicially, right in the courts. And a lot of the fights around FTOs actually have to do with their designation more than the conduct being criminalized. But if a decentralized ideology is designated as an FTO, the implications would be, I mean, I couldn't even start describing them other than just saying it would be just complete outright fascism and the criminalization of belief systems, political beliefs. In the documents that are publicly available Prairieland cases, the government tries to describe what ANTEEFAH is and what the belief system is, and it is so broad. They talk about anti-government, anti-capitalist, anti-system, anti-Trump is mentioned at one point. There's mentions of Marxism, there's mention of anarchy, right? All these belief systems are put in the and this or that, and this is what makes you ANTEEFAH, this is what makes something ANTEEFAH. It's so broad that I'm not sure if, and I hope it doesn't get an FTO designation, but if it does, then alleged support for this FTO or being a member of it or providing material help to it will be so impactful to every activist in this country, even people who don't even view themselves as anti-capitalist, anarchist, et cetera, might suddenly find themselves a part of ANTEEFAH because the government says so. So it is really concerning. And the consequences of being in any sort of relationship with an FTO are serious and criminal in nature. The FTO designation is so extreme and it's so consequential that even providing legal support to an FTO requires you to get permission and to be on a special list and get a license essentially to assist. The immediate consequences of an FTO are bank accounts being frozen, information being turned over to the government, and so on. So the prospect of ANTEEFAH being successfully labeled an FTO should really, really concern us. I mean, in the Free Palestine context, the way that association with that movement is labeled terrorist because of the existence of Hamas and the designation of FTOs in the Free Palestine context. I mean, that's resulted in people's accounts being frozen, people fleeing, people being placed in removal proceedings for very small acts. So it is very concerning. And I think that even though a lot of people on the left, laugh at the federal administration or don't take it seriously or like, oh, here we go, another shocking thing, another fabrication, that would be such an escalation that would be very, very hard to get out of because we'd have to wait for the courts to basically undo it or fix it.
Yeah, and there's a very good statement on the NLG website against the declaration of Samidoun prisoner support as being a supporter of the PFLP and getting sanctioned for that I hope that listeners will check out. Well, FTO or not, in the middle of this month, we saw an indictment of two, Cameron Arnold and Zachary Evans, two people being accused of aiding terrorism, accused of membership in a North Texas ANTEEFAH cell. Ostensibly, this is what they're referring to as the Elm Fork John Brown Gun Club that Benjamin Song is alleged to have participated in, and which has acted as a boogeyman for at least 7 or 8 years for the far right in that part of the country and faced legal attacks in the DFW for community defense at protests. Some have pointed to the prosecution of anti-fascists building off of failed conspiracy cases like the J20 around the 2017 inauguration protests of the first Trump administration or the Stop Cop City RICO case. What do you see as the chances of prosecution convicting on domestic terrorism charges in this instance? And what do you say about their increased application against homegrown anti-authoritarian movements?
I think that there's, this often said thing in relation to the Holocaust in Germany that, first they come for these people, then they'll come for you. And I believe that this is exactly what's happening with this accusation of quote unquote domestic terrorists. A couple of months ago, there were widespread protests at Tesla dealerships because of Elon Musk's involvement with the federal government, and the government almost immediately labeled these as terrorist actors. And the protest kind of died out because Elon Musk fought Trump, and so now they're not friends anymore. So, Tesla kind of left the political scene in some ways, at least publicly. But this is the same strategy against an anti-ICE protest to label it as terrorist. And that is very concerning because the public's reaction or treatment of what the government calls quote unquote terrorists is immediate and it's felt. Even people who might be more to the center or a little bit to the left or the left, when they see that word terrorist, domestic terrorist, they don't want to touch it. They don't want anything to do with it because it makes sense. They're scared of being implicated with it. For me, through the National Lawyers Guild too, I saw this happen in the Georgia Stop Cop City domestic terrorism cases a lot, where as more people were accused of domestic terrorism, there was more and more fear from organizations, lawyers, what have you, to support this movement and these defendants. So it's very intentional. I recently was asked if I think the domestic terrorism statutes are being misused. And my understanding of it from a professional, scholar, academic, political lens is that no, they're being used exactly as they're designed to be used. The government is labeling terrorism certain forms of conduct intentionally to stop them. So, yes, I mean, I think we've entered a chapter, maybe after 9/11 especially, where things get called terrorism to stop them or to scare people, and it's happening again. Now, and I have to say, right, there is an accusation of attempted murder in the Prairieland cases, which I think has also made people scared of touching it. But taking a step back, protests and rallies going sideways, shots being fired, people getting hurt, police officers getting attacked is not that uncommon, especially through 2020. This type of incident has happened, will happen, is happening, where just protests change and shift. But this one is being called terrorism. What I'll say too about this boogeyman, this Antifa boogeyman, is that when you ask someone to explain to you what is the Antifa cell, right? Where is it meeting? Who's in charge of it? How do they communicate? How do they recruit? What you end up hearing in response is usually just the description of an ideology and a set of beliefs and people gathering to talk about things. So yeah, I mean, it is scary. It should concern us that this is how the government is starting to deal with a political belief system.
I do recall in the last couple of years, but I remember hearing people being concerned about legislation being passed that would basically say that if anything violent occurs at a demonstration, the state can determine people other than the people who commit the violence as being the responsible parties for it. So for instance, if somebody coordinates a demonstration and then someone decides to show up and brings a gun and it goes off or they shoot someone or something, that it's necessarily the fault of the promoters and also maybe of the attendees. Like there's a sort of like conspiratorialism impacted or like imposed upon public demonstrations where things go sideways. Is that a thing that you're familiar with?
Yes. So I think you're referencing to, liability based on organizing. So I cannot remember what states have passed these laws, but they exist across the country where if an organizer or organization calls for a rally and action, and then a participant commits a crime or is alleged to commit an offense, then the organizers are liable too, right? As in a conspiracy or just by law, they are responsible. This is a legal reality for many places. And although I think that they can be challenged and there's these issues of intent and knowledge, this is where the law or where people are making laws to create liability. So it should be very concerning too, because as activism evolves and in the modern era in the United States, a lot of protests are very, very decentralized. There is no central organizer. Organizations might put their logo on a flyer, but they're not like gathering the supplies and putting together the meetings and putting together the chants. A lot of protests are happening spontaneously, sometimes as simple as like, let's meet at this place, and then hundreds of people show up because they're so outraged at a situation. In this situation that we're facing, the government just has to find someone who they believe or can allege organized this. And all that they might need or argue is that, look, you have the message that says, great, let's meet at this time, right? And now they frame this person as the organizer. So yeah, I mean, I think naturally activists and organizers are responding with even more security practices and more encrypted communication in response to these laws and this government that can put basically anyone around a protest in jail or to face liability.
Okay, yeah, I just found an article from April of 2024 talking about SCOTUS upholding protest liability being applied towards organizers and laws being passed at that time, at least in Mississippi, Texas, and Louisiana. Outside of the DFW case, would you speak a bit about the application of conspiracy charges being faced by people protesting in other parts of the U.S.? I'm thinking of Chicago and San Francisco as some examples.
Yes. So in criminal legal world, conspiracy is called the prosecutor's darling because it is easy to allege a conspiracy, and the legal requirements to prove one are also less than actually proving what the crime was or what is alleged to have happened. So the theories that the government is advancing, and we saw this in like full force in the Georgia Stop Cop City RICO case, is that social movements and social ideologies are conspiring in criminal ways to commit certain activity. And the theories are getting more and more, I'm going to say, ambitious or outrageous, that being in a signal group chat together is evidence that you were a part of this conspiracy, that you were agreeing to an outcome and taking criminal conduct to complete it. What this logic, this expansion of conspiracy means is that, yeah, I mean, proximity or in any way touching something that happened could get you in the hook. And then once you're a co-conspirator, you are now in this like web of accusations. So it is, I mean, and as you mentioned, there are federal conspiracies being accused in Chicago. I believe there's some coming on in Portland, some in Los Angeles. And the conspiracies, when you look at them and read behind all this like inflammatory criminal conduct language, just seem to be protests and rallies and demonstrations where things happen, property gets damaged, people start shoving, right? Things kind of get out of hand, but they're framed that all the people who were around it or involved or in the chat were doing this on purpose with a certain conspiracy goal. Yeah, so it is, and in the end, right, like the immediate outcome, and I think this is the purpose, is to make people stop coming to spontaneous protest, standing up against injustice, expressing dissent. That is where people reach conclusions, right? Oh, I'm not going to go because if I go and something goes wrong, they're just going to arrest me and say I was a part of that as well. And that goes back to what I was saying before about people suddenly talking to the police because they didn't even think about a conspiracy or any criminal conduct, but the government suddenly alleges, nope, you were involved, you were a part of this. See, here's all the acts you took as part of the conspiracy. Speak up and tell me why you're not in it. So yeah, the decision to charge these ways are intentional, and they have these very serious outcomes for the right to protest, the right to speak, the right to assemble.
So I guess finally, to sort of wrap up, and I really appreciate the time that you've taken to have this conversation, Xavier. Like one of the outcomes of the conversation, one of the things that Mo Meltzer-Cohen and I talked about was about how the intent apparently of the 2025 driven Trump administration at this point in terms of this war on anti-fascists has been to build this conspiracy web of red strings to go after what they're considering to be funding sources or infrastructure of the international ANTEEFAH conspiracy, right? And one thing has been to go after civil society organizations. And I want to bring up that the NLG has received some focus of recent by the right. What's this about the Texas Republican House members jawboning the National Lawyers Guild? What infrastructure is coming under attack during this newest Red Scare? And how can civil society defend institutions like the NLG that defend civil society?
What happened a couple of weeks ago was that a Texas representative, to the House, to the federal House of Representatives, sent a very long letter to the Department of Justice, a public letter, demanding, requesting, asking that the National Lawyers Guild and a bunch of other associated organizations be investigated, 501c3 investigations, and so on. And this isn't the first time this happens to a nonprofit recently, especially in the Free Palestine context. There are public letters sent often to the Department of Justice, to the IRS, to the Department of Treasury, and these politicians make the letters public right, for their audience, for the masses that they say they represent. So it is a scare tactic. It is a way for these politicians to signal or to tell people, look at these scary people, scary enemies. But with this federal government especially, these outrageous, outlandish accusations sometimes do become actual investigations, letters, subpoenas, harassment, prosecutions, and so on. What is especially bad about this country's situation is that the federal government is taking advice, insight, information from conservative right-winger pundits, right, personalities, conspiracy theories who have made themselves popular for the past 2 decades through, their YouTube channels, their X accounts, and so on. But these are where they're getting their information from. These are their tips, right? Their informants, the people guiding criminal enforcement investigations. And their idea of the left, of dissent, are so false, fabricated, crazy. But that is where a lot of the federal government agents get their guidance from. On top of that, I don't want to paint a scene that's too scary, but it is what's happening. The federal government, the Trump administration, has replaced a lot of longtime prosecutors, FBI agents that perhaps a couple of years ago would be seen as rational, reasonable, upholding the law. The government is putting their people in all these positions, often through procedural maneuvers, avoiding the Senate, avoiding appointment processes. And so they have set up a system where an order comes from the top and it will be executed without question, like, oh, is this legal? Oh, should we do this? Is there enough probable cause? Is this a political question, right? All these things that usually lawyers or prosecutors ask themselves. But even though this is all very scary, the purpose is to silence. And that is the goal of governments that don't want people protesting. It's to stop it. So my position and NLG's position is that then we need to get louder, right? We need to advocate even more for people who are being repressed. We need to make it even clearer that ourselves, our organizations, our companies don't agree with these policies. We need to make boundaries with who we are working with and how we're working together that reflects our values. So, the goal of governments like this one is to silence us and make us shy away and, and go underground and stop talking. Therefore, the response should be exactly that, right? Talking, not going underground, going even more above ground and speaking up even clearer about the situation. Also, historically, it's not the first time that the National Lawyers Guild gets attacked or gets labeled to be the legal arm of the left, of dissent, of progressive, of protests. But I think what is different in some ways is the behavior of this federal government, especially. It's so relentless and it doesn't believe that the systems apply to it anymore. It breaks rules all the time and then gets checked on it by this court and then does it again in another way.
Well, Xavier, thank you so much for this conversation. Is there anything that we left out that you wanted to address?
For me, the advice National Lawyers Guild gives that I would give professionally is that if there is repression, federal repression, state repression, right, anything involving law enforcement and investigation, if that happens, people need to assert their rights proactively. They need to remain silent. They need to refuse searches. And they need to contact a lawyer. And then I would add, they should consider speaking out about it and going public about it so that more people know what's happening and how the government is behaving, so that then they can learn more and educate themselves and refresh on their rights. Often, a lot of raids and door knocks and investigations happen in silence, and so people don't even know that it could happen to them. But I think that we all should be educating ourselves and preparing for the repression that is escalating. I think the ICE enforcement around the country and the way ICE is behaving should tell us just how far this federal government will go against people it doesn't like or doesn't want. And yeah, so we should all remain alert and tight with each other, in good relationships, trusting our people, and so on. I know a lot of our messaging tends to be negative, right? Like defend, resist, struggle. But for me, that also means holding your people tighter, checking in with your people, having people to begin with. If you don't have aligned people around you, because where you are or your family or your work isn't that friendly, then fostering those relationships is even more important now.
And the NLG does offer a lot of resources that are available at nlg.org. If you have a chapter in your area, reach out and see about getting a legal rights presentation or consulting right. And if you're visited by federal law enforcement or by law enforcement generally, how can folks reach out to the National Lawyers Guild for support in that?
Because of the National Lawyers Guild structure, the best support will come from local members and local chapters. So if something happens in an area, that's where people should look at first. Our chapters are listed in our website. And if that doesn't lead to any help, then they should contact us nationally at the Men's Defense Program, emails in our website as well. And then there's also a federal anti-repression hotline that people can call if they have a verified federal contact that is not immigration related. So, FBI, ATF, DEA, etc. They can also call the hotline, which is also in our website. But I always say, and I'll always repeat, that the best legal support will always come from someone who's local, a lawyer who is around the area, maybe not in the same county, but at least in the same region, or worse comes to worse, in the state, because the way that rules are used and laws are enforced and police behave is very different place to place. At the end of the day, in this country, a New York City criminal defense attorney will not be able to give advice to someone in rural Montana that suddenly gets a federal door knock. The laws are different, the circumstances are different, and in the end, that person would need a Montana lawyer to help them if things continue to escalate.
Well, thanks again for the time, and I hope that the listenership can find this helpful, useful, and help bolster our sense of solidarity and ability to face what comes.
Thanks for having me.
This is The Final Straw Radio, and you just heard Xavier de Janon of the NLG Mass Defense Program. If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various streaming platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.media. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce for each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, or LibrePay. Or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.media/support. Finally, if you'd like to hear us on your local radio station, visit tfsr.media/radio to find more info or reach out to us for some help. Thanks for listening.
On Tuesday, the home of Aurora Luz was raided in the early morning hours. Aurora, a nurse from the Philippines, was supplying free health care to undocumented workers in Central California. She attacked the agents and managed to escape.
So she's essentially giving free health care to undocumented migrant workers. And so, they had her. They surrounded her. They got her pinned against the wall, and they're like, give us that contact list. We want your contact list, and they got the shotgun with the red beanbag one. She's like, Tangina mo, I ain't saying shit. She went like this, he went like this, and she was out that bitch. Look at these out-of-shape ICE agents. Bulletproof vest to go arrest a dying cancer patient. Lining up for signing bonuses and weapons in hopes that you can live more respected. Let's break it down. You gon' have to tell your kids what you did when they see the Disney movie of what we currently in. You gon' have to tell them that the bad guy in a plot, well, that was your grandpa. That was you chasing down your own people for a check. If you go with racism, homie, say it with your chest. Fuck the values on the right and the left, long as value is controlled by a salary net. Cause the value that's attached to a reward's not real. If I told you ain't no heaven, would you do right still? It go what, 1, 2, 1, 2. They made you afraid of what brown people will do. Ooh, well, I hope you smarter than they think you are. They think you'll ignore it and go back and swiping debit cards. What, 1, 2, 1, 3. They gon' change the story just to burn what you see. I know you slicker than that, bro. Live and direct from the town. What up, dog? Hey, yo, Mark ass, can't fight, no hands. Masked up, dork ass, untrained. This is my town with your hoe ass. Tear gas babies in they stroller with your dumb ass. Loking up on teenage girls with your grown ass. Ask me for my papers and I'm laughing at your nerd ass. Oh, I know I look like dudes who bullied you in math class. 1 + 1, 2 punches at your square ass. Frightened by the sight of my mustache with your scared ass. Call the federales out to Cali. Fleet Marine veteran, migrante ass family. I believe in freedoms not listed in constitutions. I believe in getting needs met for other humans. And go what, 1 2 1 2. I am Bamboo of the Beat Rock crew, the chairman of the Boom Bap and speaking the truth. Bam, brack, self-defense with a snub nose. It go what, 1 2 1 2. They made you afraid of what brown people will do. Ooh. I hope you smarter than they think you are. They think you'll ignore it. Just go back and swipe and debit cards. What, 1 2 1 3. They gon' change the story just to blur what you see. I know you slicker than that, bro. Live and direct from the town. What up, though? What up, though? No, she ended up.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
Yeah, so we're members of the DFW Support Committee. We are the defense committee for the Prairieland defendants. We are a group of people, loved ones, family members, partners, spouses, who are supporting the defendants through the legal process and are working for them to come home, right? To give them the strongest defense possible so that they can beat these bogus charges and come back to their families and friends and community.
So far, what we've done is we've done fundraising. We've done stuff like this on media to try to get another version of the story out there than the official narrative from the government. And we've done, organizing, trying to get more people sort of aware of the case, the importance of the case, and to realize the power of solidarity that we have in situations like this.
So listeners to this hopefully have heard our conversation with Xavier just before this, sort of contextualizing the case a little bit more. And I've spoken with members of the committee before, but just as sort of an update, because a lot has happened in the days since I talked to Xavier around the case, would you all mind talking about any updates in the case, the superseding indictments, that sort of stuff?
Sure. So to start with, I want to clarify for folks, and this was clarified in the interview with Xavier, but I just want to talk about it again because this case has got sort of multiple things going on. So there's a set of federal cases and there's a set of state cases. And there are a group of people who are sort of the main defendants that have both federal charges and state charges. There's a small group of people who have just state charges, and then there's one person who has just federal charges. So one of the things that happened this week is that there was a superseding indictment that was filed on Thursday, and this indictment included the following defendants. Let me preface this by saying that we're going to use people's actual names. Several defendants on the case are transgender and had legal name changes, and the federal government is refusing to acknowledge these legal name changes, and so we're not going to do that. So Autumn Hill, Zachary Evitz, Benjamin Song, Savannah Batten, Megan Morris, Maricela Rueda, Elizabeth Soto, Inez Soto, and Daniel Roland Sanchez Estrada. So these defendants were indicted on Thursday, and not everyone was indicted with the same charges, but they were indicted together. The implications of this is that everyone will be in the same trial together as this indictment stands. So I'm going to kind of go through what the charges are. I'm probably not going to talk about which defendants have which charges, but basically where we're at is, so some of these are new, some of these were not on the federal complaint. So the charges that are new are a count of riot. We have providing material support to terrorists. We have conspiracy to use and carry an explosive. And then we have use and carry of an explosive. So these are the charges that were not on the original federal complaint for these defendants. The charges that were on the original federal complaint are 3 counts of attempted murder of an officer employee of the United States, discharging a firearm in relation to and furtherance of a violent crime. There's 3 of these charges. And then the other thing that's novel about this indictment is that they've included Daniel Sanchez Estrada, also known as Dez, in this set of indictments. Dez is not indicted in any of the previous charges. That's really important. Dez has 2 charges, one of which is corruptly concealing a document or record, and the other is conspiring to conceal documents. Dez's case is the case around allegedly transporting zines. So Dez has been indicted with the other group of defendants as well. So what this means is that originally Autumn Hill and Zachary Evitz were set to go to court for trial on November the 24th. One of the things that I think is a particular feature of this federal district is that this federal district moves incredibly fast. Those of us that have dealt with and supported people through federal trials before, outside of this district, have been surprised by how quickly things are moving through the courts in the federal case. As you spoke about with Javier, the federal court judge deemed this case as complex. There was a pushback to try and get that designated taken away. It was denied. So that changes the timeline of this case. It is possible that 5 weeks from now is the week of Christmas. So there is a possibility that the trial could be set for that. But we seem to think that most likely the trial will be set in January of 2026. For folks that are familiar with federal cases, that probably seems like a crazy turnaround. Our sense is that things here move much more quickly. And so probably it is pretty realistic to think that in the early months of 2026, all of these defendants will be facing trial together. The other thing that happened this week is previously another defendant,
Janet Goring,
was arrested in relationship to what is kind of referred to as the manhunt case. I'm going to let you speak a little more about that.
Yeah, so for those who don't remember, one of the defendants on this indictment that we just read is Benjamin Song. And this is a person who was not apprehended at the protest or around the protest, but was picked up about 10 days later. And there's allegations of people trying to have helped hide that person. We call it the manhunt because there was a multi-state manhunt. It involved a blue alert getting pushed to people's phones in Oklahoma and Houston and San Antonio, as well as Dallas. And there's a number of cases that have to do with that. And some of those cases are only on the state level. For example, Janet Goring at this point only has state level charges.
And Dario Sanchez. So there's a Daniel Sanchez and a Dario Sanchez.
Well, it's Daniel Sanchez Estrada.
Yes. Dario Sanchez also only has state charges at this point. So Janet, this week, her lawyer put in for a bond reduction. And at this bond reduction, several things happened that were notable. One is that Dario was there because his lawyer is also Janet's lawyer, and the prosecution, in a surprise, called him up to the stand and was threatening his bond conditions. And then on top of that, the prosecution brought forward evidence that was not given to the defense. And when the lawyer for Janet attempted to object to that, the judge did not really seem to care, which is sort of an indication that it's not a surprise to us because Johnson County is perceived by many lawyers and many people in Texas as an extremely corrupt county, that it is a plea mill. So people get arrested for small things and then get pled up to bigger things and push through really a system just interested in getting numbers. And this has also been part of the challenge of this case, is that Johnson County is just notorious for this. If folks don't know, Johnson County is the county that used the flock surveillance software to track a woman that they believed had an out-of-state abortion. It is also the county where the sheriff was recently indicted on witness tampering, sexual harassment, and perjury. The judge, in that case, decided that even though the sheriff was indicted in those charges, he was still fit to work, and he is still the sheriff of Johnson County. So that might give you an indication of the kind of place that people are fighting charges in. So unfortunately, Janet's bond reduction was denied. And in fact, it was like literally just a sentence of denial with no discussion as to why, even though there was character witnesses given and was a pretty full hearing.
And previous defendants have had their bonds reduced, including Dario Sanchez. So it's notable that at this point, the judge felt like they didn't need to even give an explanation. I think this dynamic of Johnson County is important for supporters and people to follow and care about. You know, it's funny because the federal level, people around the country, this impacts, right? This is going to be a test case for that. But it is also really important to remember that these are people, right? And they're facing what are the kind of bread and butter injustices of our system, where these small counties with rural sheriffs and rural judges can just bulldoze over people and railroad people. And it's kind of our responsibility to not only fight for the kinds of legal precedents that might impact people in other places, but also fight to make sure that people in our movement get the kind of justice they deserve, even in places like Johnson County.
Well, and that also to bring to light the fact that these kinds of small town justice systems are so incredibly corrupt, right? And not like people in that county can't get good public defense. And that lawyers in that county who are private lawyers, right? Like when we started talking to people, like people are looking at $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $100,000 to do just cases in Johnson County, right? And like, who can afford that, right? This is a small rural county, and the people that are regularly coming through the justice system there are not rich people, right? And they are majority not white. And I think that that is important for people to understand the kinds of, this is not something new, but the kinds of daily injustices that are happening to people across the country in these smaller towns matters, right? And so this case just helps shine a light on that. I think those are the biggest updates that we have.
That's right. There are other people who were charged on something called an information. You know, a lot of this is sort of part of defense work is getting familiar with all this legal jargon, inside baseball stuff. But there's two ways that the state can move forward with the charges, either indictment or on information. And on information doesn't have to go through a grand jury. And it basically only ever happens during a plea deal when the defendant consents. So we're not going to go to the details of what is going on for those people, but there are another set of people who are only now being charged with material support of terrorism.
Yeah, the material support of terrorism charge is a charge that's been historically used around folks of the Muslim faith. And so that is sort of a novel prosecutorial move that's happening in this case. And you should talk a little bit.
Yeah, it is something that people should pay attention to because it's a very vague and dangerous statute. I'm not a lawyer. I can't speak to sort of all the legal ins and outs of it. But my understanding is that the way it's structured, it's actually more material support for an underlying crime. And the underlying crime is not terrorism. The underlying crime is some list of federal crimes that were deemed sort of terroristic in nature or something. And so, but it's a big grab bag. And it includes things from like, you know, trying to kill federal officers to stealing nuclear materials, all the way down to petty property destruction. And that's those kinds of crimes. So what we're dealing with here is a situation where the state can kind of shoehorn in and kind of Trojan horse in the label terrorism without necessarily having to prove that people did or supported something that a normal human being, a commonsensical understanding of, quote, terrorism would be, which is probably something like doing those crimes in furtherance of a goal of changing public policy or something like that. The statute isn't written that way. And it's kind of more like material support for a crime. And, you know, it's very dangerous and it's going to potentially set a precedent for people in other contexts.
Yeah, like looking at histories of prosecution for terrorism of at least like leftists that I can think of, or, you know, like I'm thinking the Green Scare, for instance, or a bunch of the animal liberation cases with the building of terrorism enhancements for property destruction or for boycotts or for public pressure in some cases, like with the Shack case, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, where the methodology that was being accused of like being employed in those cases, like it's just it basically, as you say, there's crimes that are being alleged, but this is a way to launder in increased charges associated with those, like larger penalties, when there's already a crime against arson, for instance, or there's already a crime, I'm sure, about like carrying a firearm at a, you know, like a federal institution or whatever. But throwing on that extra terrorism charge, especially when it gets spread around to just people that are adjacent too. I could see, like, is that kind of the precedent that you're also pointing to here, is the building of conspiracy by casting a very wide net and getting a bunch of people in on those same charges?
Yeah, and I think the material support aspect of this, where you launder in somebody who didn't necessarily do something but had some relationship, maybe drove them to the protest or something, is where things are going to get dangerous. I think that for me, one of the really important things about this indictment is it does kind of make clear how similar this case is to charges around something like the Broadview Detention Center in Illinois. I think a lot of people, in my experience, still kind of see the Prairieland case as different from other protest cases because there was guns involved and an officer allegedly got injured, right? There's like, people are like, oh, well, that was this weird thing that doesn't apply to me. But when we're talking about a charge like material support of terrorism or riot, these are the same kind of legal theories and arguments that the feds are applying to Broadview, right? And so the precedence that they're going to set in our case is going to apply to people who are trying to be brave and stand up against rising authoritarianism and against ICE in other contexts. And people shouldn't assume that, oh, well, we're not those crazies who bring guns to stuff, right? It's like, that doesn't matter here. The state doesn't care about that. They're looking to suppress dissent more generally. And I think people really need to appreciate the fact that the Prairieland case is a protest case. And it is a protest case that's going to have implications for other more traditional protest cases.
I want to add, too, that I think when we think about things nationally, we look at the landscape of ICE detention. Where are the majority of actual ICE detention centers? They're in the South. They're in Louisiana. They're in Texas. They're in Florida. They're in these red states with deeply conservative federal and state judiciaries. And that having a group of people, both federally and state, be designated as terrorists for standing up to the sort of activities of disappearing and kidnapping people that we know are associated with fascist and authoritarian regimes, right, is extremely dangerous, right? Because when this moves past, it's already moving past. Like, originally they're like, oh, we're just going to get criminals. And all of us were like, mm-hmm. And they're like, well, now we're just getting people who are here undocumented. And we're like, mm-hmm. And now they're like, well, are you here on a green card? Have you said anything on the social media we don't like? Like the increase of who that is becoming is getting wider and wider. And we know where that's going to go, right? It's going to go to anyone who is against the Trump regime and Steve Miller and this whole body of people, Greg Abbott, like these right-wing folks who are in control of the state governments of Louisiana and Florida and Texas. And then those folks are going to be placed in detention centers in those states, right? A lot of the flights going to Surcot in El Salvador were coming out of Texas. So if we're thinking about the context of what this fight is going to look like as we go forward, right, these states are actually really important. And ceding this ground in a place like Texas is going to become a huge obstacle to a movement to fight the authoritarianism that exists in this specific regime.
In case people didn't catch the reference to Broadview, could one of you say a few things about what that circumstance is?
Sure. So Broadview is a suburb of Chicago, and it's where one of the main ICE facilities that is, I believe, still being used as part of the, quote, Midway Blitz crackdown by ICE in Chicago. And over the course of several weeks, there were escalating protests outside of the Broadview Detention Center by people attempting to gum up the works and slow the wave of deportations and ICE activities and just sort of open their voice. And there were a lot of very striking images of repression coming through, social media and stuff, of people getting dragged and tear gas and all this kind of stuff. And there's been a number of federal cases that have come out, including against someone who's running for public office, accusing people of, I don't know the exact charges, so I don't want to speak exactly what the charges were, but similar offenses, and making clear that the kind of repressive approach that we're seeing in Prairieland is not isolated to Texas.
Yeah. One of the novel things that has happened is that there was a set of things like using your car to impede a federal agent that have now become actual criminal statutes. They were supposed to go into effect in January, but the Trump administration, the beginning of November, put out a memo that they we're moving up the timeline for those given the activity at ICE facilities, right? So again, we're talking about repression. Part of what's complicated about all of this is that there's the normal state repression, right? People are fighting for their liberation and the state reacts to that. The piece that complicates this is that the Trump administration does not care about the law. It doesn't care about the Constitution. It doesn't care about the norms that we have been operating under for the last, whatever set of years, a while, right? And so we can have a debate about sort of Obama and Biden versus Trump. However, one of the things that is striking is that, right, the Trump administration lies a lot more and pushes a lot of envelopes around legality. And, we're seeing this sort of hyperbolic narrative that has no basis in reality showing up in this case, right? And to me, it has the feeling of what is called a moral panic, right? And I think when people get into that mindset, people are willing to accept narratives that have very little factual basis. And this is something we've seen a lot on the right. And so, I think that is something that we have to think about is we have to fight in the courts, and we also have to be prepared to know that the Trump administration is going to say whatever they want. If people have been paying attention to what's happening in LA, after the Trump administration's push into LA, there was a series of cases in which the charges got dropped, and the judge actually was very frustrated and publicly was like, you guys need to stop bringing me fake evidence. Which is notable. That, for whatever we want to say about past administrations, usually the Department of Justice doesn't fake that much evidence. They're just sometimes ineffective. But that's a different set of rules to play under. And that's something that some of what came out in the preliminary hearing was this sort of gun residue evidence that there's a lot of problems with in terms of it actually being real. It kind of reminds you of what people know now about sort of arson science, the science of fire that was used, or even the shaken baby syndrome. I don't know if folks are familiar with shaken baby syndrome, but there is actually a really big case in Texas right now of a guy that's sitting on death row. The scientific evidence behind shaken baby syndrome has largely shown that it's not real, and that there have been people who were convicted, and this person who's sitting on death row and narrowly avoided execution now twice on this charge, right? And so even though there may not be factual basis for a set of pseudoscience, the state will still use it and can still get convictions.
I guess kind of pivoting a little bit to the implications or precedent related to this, I noticed that some of the information that the Defense Committee put out related to the case of Palestinian solidarity activist Casey Goonan and their sentencing earlier this year to a very long time behind bars, which sort of shifted throughout Casey's case. Can you talk about them briefly, about Casey and the sort of precedent you fear their sentencing sets that could impact this DFW case and other ones moving forward?
Yeah, for those who aren't aware, Casey Goonan is a Palestinian solidarity activist who has a case in the Bay Area, and the allegations are around a series of arsons or something like that. And I kind of can speak to the case particular and stuff like that. But what happened was that after a sort of long build up to trial, it was decided for Casey to take a plea deal. The federal government, as part of the plea deal, made an offer of, I think it was 15 years, and it's always in months in federal stuff, so it's a little confusing. And, as you do, you go to your plea hearing to plead guilty as part of your deal, and the prosecution will recommend to the judge a sentence. And that's how the structure of a plea deal works. It's not a guarantee. It's what the prosecution recommends. In normal times, the judge is going to follow the prosecution's recommendation, both for expediency and because, that's kind of a norm that we've set and you can kind of expect. If plea deals were always roll the dice, people would likely take plea deals, right? But what happened in this case was the judge accepted the guilty plea, but then issued a sentence far exceeding the actual recommendation by the prosecution. It's a very tragic outcome for Casey and their loved ones. It's a very scary outcome for anybody else facing plea deals. And I think as a sort of litmus test of the moment we're in, it's very important because this was in California. This was in the Bay Area, right? And whether or not this judge particularly is representative, yada, yada, I think that people should really realize that the winds are changing for the state. And in 2020, around the George Floyd uprising, there were a lot of cases, there were a lot of plea deals, and there were a lot of cases that got dropped. And a lot of people who faced what might seem like less time than they would have in other contexts because of the mass support for that movement and for the sort of general political climate of that context. Casey's case, to me, is a really important indication that things are sort of different for us. And I don't think that should mean that we should be afraid and that we shouldn't be doing bold action and that we shouldn't be doing what we need to do to support the people of Palestine and Gaza. But I do think it means that we as a movement need to be very smart about the kinds of risks we're taking and how we take them. And we should not hold illusions that just because we're in California or Oregon or New York or whatever, that we're going to be facing a more quote unquote sympathetic judiciary as opposed to what we're dealing with here in Texas. I think people should really realize that, an injury to one is an injury to all, right? Like we are all in a similar sinking ship right now. And the struggle for that cannot be isolated to certain people in certain places.
I think it also points to the fact that folks in defense committees need to think about how to support people to go all the way to trial and how to win at trial, right? And I think going to trial is extremely scary for a lot of reasons. And we often have better outcomes at trial, right? Something like 93% of all crimes are pled out for a reason. And that is why, part of the stance of most of the defendants is that they're going to go to trial. They believe that they are not guilty. They know they are not guilty. They want to have their day to prove their innocence and to talk about why they were doing what they were doing, right? And to also really push and challenge the sort of walls coming in around First Amendment protest and speech, right, that we all are seeing. So I think that unfortunately, this is a tragedy that is, having ripple effects for everyone that is facing, cases right now in the federal system.
Kind of pivoting to a different point. Since my chat with Xavier was recorded, the State Department declared a few far left and anarchist entities as specially designated foreign terrorists, among which was a reference to the ANTEEFAH Ost case and the Budapest complex case based around Germany and Hungary, which the statement also mentioned that the Orban regime in Hungary was labeling the defendants in the Germany-based ANTEEFAH Ost case as a terrorist group. For listeners who'd like to learn more about this case, we did a December 8th, 2024 interview sort of going through some of the ins and outs of a very complicated mesh, and there are some links in that as to what support and anti-repression groups are able to tell folks and about the defendants in the cases. It seems that the administration is trying to build a case of formal, internationally tied organizations so that they can apply FTO status, foreign terrorist organization status, to people that they don't like who are within the U.S. And the statements coming out of Texas in relation to this DFW case have been referring to this being related to an Antifa cell in North Texas. They're setting up the framework for that already, it feels like. Does the State Department designation of groups in Germany affect the case in Texas? Or if it doesn't, do you have any comment on this and the wider conspiracy dreaming of the administration?
It right now does not have a direct effect on the case. I think it's important to say that this is not an Antifa cell. Antifa cells don't exist, right? There are people who identify as anti-fascists. This is something that people have taken up as their own political perspective for an extremely long time. And so the labeling of people fighting against fascist forms of governance, fascist forms of society, authoritarian forms of society, right, as a terrorist organization, has a chilling effect, obviously. I think while it doesn't have a direct impact, I think that it's clear that the Department of Justice would love to be able to tie a nice little bow around anyone they're labeling Antifa and connect them to a foreign organization that they can now have a legal precedent tied to, right? Because part of the challenge with their domestic terrorism policy is that there isn't actual legal statutes behind that. It doesn't mean it doesn't have any weight. The legal precedent is around FTOs, as you call them, right? This is where the material support for terrorism also ties in, and so is it related to this case in the sense that, like, I think the Trump administration would love to make up some bullshit to connect to people? Absolutely.
I mean, I think that it's easy to sort of brush off this announcement from the State Department of saying, oh, well, those are just a handful of groups and maybe you know their backstory of these groups, maybe you don't, but none of them seem like household names, right? So, like, it does feel a little different from like what's going on in England with Palestine Action being labeled a terrorist organization. And that was an organization that had a lot of mass support and was doing very public actions. And these are maybe smaller organizations and actions that people can think of as fringe, right, in this designation. But I think people should realize that this is not the end of the story, right? This is the first set of anti-fascist organizations and anarchist organizations that the Trump administration is labeling foreign terrorist organizations. And sure, they're in Europe, but there is a lot of relationship between the left in Europe and the left in North America. And there's relationships between Canada as a different country as well, right? Like these relationships across the US-Canada border are also foreign relationships. And there are things to be worried about down the pike. And the winds are not blowing in a good direction from this designation. To me, one of the things that's striking about it is it's a further example of the internationalism on the right that we're seeing. The Trump movement has really tried to position itself within a larger global movement and milieu of the far right. With Viktor Orban, with Javier Milei, all across the planet, they are trying to build an alliance, an axis, to use a loaded term, of far-right movements and governments. And the fact that they chose to start not with sort of random anti-fascist organizations, but with anti-fascist organizations that the Orban government in Hungary has been pissed about is a little bit of a quid pro quo handshake, we're all buddies here kind of dynamic that I think should be really worrisome, because that's a dynamic that's very complicated and has a lot of implications that could cause other things down the road.
Yeah, and I would add that just like the case that, we're supporting people through here, right? People originally were like, oh, this is this fringe case. We're like, no, this is the first case like this, right? These are the first organizations to be designated as this, right? We know more will be designated, and they probably will start to move more into the center, right? I mean, I think if we look at, the other prosecutions that Trump is interested in, right? Trump himself seems to be a deeply vengeful man. And the former FBI director, James Comey, that they're going after, right? Like, that guy, but also it's an indication of what the DOJ thinks is possible. Mm-hmm. And it's really clear, right, that Trump and Miller are appointing themselves people in those departments that will do what they want them to do and think in the same kind of vein. And so I don't think we should be surprised when the Trump DOJ and the State Department start designating groups that we would think of as more mainstream or moderate as foreign terrorist organizations. And that's also a moment when the implications are going to become much broader for everyone. I think if folks are younger and we're not aware of what happened after 2001 and the Bush regime's enemy combatant designation, I think that people should become familiar with CIA black sites, with the enemy combatant designations, the kinds of things that happened to especially the Muslim community after 9/11, right, are implicated by this kind of designation. Because foreign terrorist organizations don't have to go through civilian courts. They can go through military courts. And that is a very different system. This is why we still have people sitting in Guantanamo Bay today, right? Some of whom, for sure, did nothing, were in the wrong place at the wrong time and have been sitting there, and now they don't know what to do with these folks, right? And so, I mean, I think if we're looking at history and how this has played out, like one of the things the Trump administration is doing is they are using past precedent. They're using some of the worst things that Biden did. They're using some of the worst things Obama did, right? And like just expanding on those. And we can see from the Patriot Act and all of that kind of where this can go to the extreme. And that's not, again, to make people be scared. Like, it is scary, but it's also to say that we can be prepared, right? And we should be prepared. And we should be having conversations with the people that we love, with the people that we live with, to prepare ourselves for what comes next, to prepare ourselves if we go to a protest and the state decides that that protest needs to be heavily repressed and we find ourselves sitting in jail on charges that we know are not true, which is the case for all of the people in Prairieland, right? So, I mean, that's the takeaway for us, is like, how do we get prepared? How do we understand what's happening? And I think the other piece of this is like, in the course of this case, we've come across so many people and lawyers who were like, well, this is just not how it's done. This is not how things normally happen. And we're like, yeah, we're not in normal anymore. And we have to stop thinking in terms of normalcy and having a normalcy bias. And we have to actually really start seeing what's happening around us. And that isn't to make us more paranoid. It's to make us to have a stronger analysis of what's coming so that we can act. And we can act smartly and boldly and strategically and provide the most amount of solidarity and safety to each other, right?
Yeah, I think that point, how to manage, because what we're talking about is very scary. It's very alarming. And some of these things are speculation, like things could go in that direction. They could go in this direction. The reason why I think it's important to think about that is not to go into an anxiety hole, but to realize the stakes of the moment we're in, where things have not gone all the way, but things are headed in a direction. And that's a very important moment, because we now have the opportunity as people in the world to do things to change the course of history, to prevent the more damaging and dangerous and scary things to happen, right? There's no one blueprint for that. There's no magic button, and there's no way we're going to do it without taking risks. But inaction is a choice as well. So people who are listening to this, now is the time to do something to protect the life that you have now and to build for the life that you want to have. Because normal is gone. We can all light a candle and say goodbye to normal, but we're not yet in the darkest of places. And there's still time to do something. There's still time to be brave. It's still worth it to stand up in solidarity with your community and fight for the life that you want.
And I think the piece of that matters, right, is that like we understand and we know that the status quo sucks, right? And that we're not fighting for the status quo, that we're fighting for a life with meaning, for lives in which we have what we need, right? And that we don't have to merely survive, but that people can feel safe and can thrive and can be who they are and live how they want to live, right? And that's the fight worth having. I see a lot on social media of people saying, what would I have done if I were there in Spain with Franco and whatever? And, I think the thing is that like, the question should be, what can you do right now? Right? People are challenging the disappearances and the kidnappings by ICE in a lot of different ways. Supporting the Prairieland defendants is one way. However, there are cases all over the place, right, that are developing, and those folks need that support. We are facing economic uncertainty. If you watch the economic news, there's a lot of indicators that, things are not going great. And how do we prepare for and build together through an economic recession or depression if that comes, right? There's lots of things to be done right now that we would encourage people to do, right? We want you to support the Prairieland defendants. And also supporting the Prairieland defendants is building for the life that all of us deserve and want, right? And so we can't let ourselves be chilled from taking action by this case, right? If people stop acting because of this case, the state wins. And that is not what we want, right? We want our comrades and friends and loved ones to come home. And we want to continue to build towards a world that is liberated and free for all people.
There's a tendency, particularly on the like one-upsmanship stuff of social media, of just sort of like deriding authorities or spokespeople when they misunderstand subcultures or political movements. Like, I mean, when there's like, who's the king of the anarchists? Who's the one making the orders or whatever, that sort of thing. It is kind of funny, but I wonder if you could speak a little bit to like your impression of the amount of energy that we're putting, or if when people bring up that sort of point that like, well, you don't understand ANTEEFAH correctly, what people are getting right or what people are getting wrong or such.
Yeah, I think it's, we can laugh and we can make jokes and we can be like, oh, Portland is so safe. Why are they saying the National Guard or whatever? We can say that our enemies are silly, but I think it's really important that we don't kind of underestimate our enemies or assume that they're sort of stupid and therefore not a threat. I think, for example, what we're actually seeing in the Prairieland case is a lot more subtlety and intelligence around the approach to the far left than I think people would assume. For example, they're talking about an Antifa cell and yada, yada, and all that is fake. But the evidence they're using for it is First Amendment activity around, far left, reading zines, printing books, discussing slogans, those sorts of things that people are doing now. One of the testimony at a federal hearing by an FBI agent said that he knows that Antifa is not a membership organization and that he knows that Antifa is an ideological movement. And so what that means is they're much smarter about this and they're capable of much more subtlety when it really comes to proving things in a court of law. The importance of the case here is actually that they're going to use a moniker of Antifa as kind of a brand to shoehorn in a bunch of laws and go after what historically has been protected speech and what is the lifeblood of a leftist movement. And it's really important for people to realize that the stakes of this case are not them being dumb and therefore it's not a threat, but the stakes of this case are them using something that may be kind of vague and silly to do what they really want to do, which is go after our rights and our ability to organize.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. Where can people follow the work of the support committee or the defense committee and keep up on news about the case and maybe offer support?
Yeah, our website is dfwdefendants.wordpress.com. And there you can find links to our Instagram, to our online fundraiser. There's little profiles of the defendants with ways to write them. Support from people around the country and the world has been really heartening to people inside. And any resources you can give is always appreciated. There's also an email with something specific that you want to ask us or offer that you can email.
Specific things that people can do, right? Donating money, write letters, let people know about the case. It has been buried in a lot of news. And so getting the word out and telling more people about it is a huge help for the defendants in their fight.
And sort of linking it back to the Casey Goonan's case, also reminder that you're writing to people who hopefully will not be convicted and sentenced to anything, but people whose letters are going to get read. The information's going to get shared with prosecution. And so maybe you don't need to talk about details of the case or any sort of illegal activities, but I'm sure they could definitely use some supporting words in the conditions that they're in.
And our Instagram has guidelines for writing because some folks are in a federal facility and some folks are in a county jail, and they have very differing regulations about letters. So if you are interested in writing, I would encourage you to go to the DFW Support Committee on Instagram. And there we have a post about people's addresses, who to write to, what you can and cannot say, and things like it has to be on one side of the paper and stuff like that, that if you don't follow, they will send the letters back. So that's a great resource for folks.
DFW Support Committee is also, correct me if I'm wrong, also on Mastodon. So if you don't have a Meta account or are concerned about being observed or paying attention to or sharing information related to an ongoing case that's so politicized, Mastodon or the Fediverse is a good place to also find the same information. You can do it through a web browser. You don't have to download an app or anything. Thank you again so much for having this conversation and solidarity.
Thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being the first place to have an interview with us when this came out. It was really important. So we just really appreciate that you all are keeping on top of what's happening with the case.
This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.